Enemy power-up detected.
Welcome to Incoming Missile, a Mechwarrior Online Podcast. Well, this is our first episode, so welcome to those that are listening. My name is Cozened Indigo, and my co-host is Capn. And we are, how would you describe us, Capn?
So we're a couple of mech dad, competitive, try-hard law warriors. You know, because mech dad is like a pejorative term, right? Where it's old mans who play Mechwarrior. I only got one arm. There's a lot of people out there that throw that word around who just happen to be fathers. Mech dads, but not like me.
Yeah.
I'm one of those cool mech dads.
So we've been playing the game for a little while now. For me, that's been a couple of years. For you, Kat?
Well, I actually started in open beta, back in open beta days, and played through until after the clan invasion, and then quit mostly because of rage issues, and then came back to the game a little older and wiser, a little bit more detached a couple of years ago, and have been playing, thousands of hours ever since.
Yeah, we both play pretty regularly, and we
Too much?
try to be involved in the community. We consume, I guess, a lot of the media around it as well, forums and Reddit and Twitch streams.
We're competitive players, so we both belong to Clan Crossfire, CXF.
Some of us are more competitive than others.
So I'm the team captain for Crossfire, and we've taken part in MRBC in a couple of forms, Battle for Midway as well as MRBC, and the team goes back further than me, but we've also been doing the stock mode World Championship, which it's going okay.
Yeah, it's not too bad. So, we have decided to start this podcast as an opportunity, I guess, to talk about a game that we are involved in and that we like. There is a lot of media out there regarding Mechwarrior Online, but not a lot of podcasts.
And a lot of the rhetoric is kind of the same. It's kind of a stale meter of rhetoric, you could say.
Needs some balance, yeah. And look, we wanted to take an opportunity to have a discussion around Mechwarrior, to take the middle ground around some of the issues and topics that are out there, reviewing mechs and talking about what's hot on top, what's coming up, but doing it in a balanced way.
I think there's a lot of discussion points already out there, so we'd like to maybe unpack some of that and look at it from different angles. I mean, I'm a designer by trade in graphics and 3D, so I'm coming at it from an angle of understanding that. I'm also a casual interest in psychology and science and those sort of things, so coming at it from that angle, whereas you, Cozen?
Yeah, I'm a performance advisor in the real world. So
how am I doing?
Yeah, doing not bad.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. I just have to check your data, check your metrics. But yeah, no, I come at it from an idea that I like the game and am very average at it. So it does interest me to think about those aspects and what influences what makes someone good or perform well at the game. So yeah, just trying to bring.
So PGI would maybe have someone like you in their offices?
Well, maybe not as handsome, but that's certainly I'm sure there's people that look at data and ask what it means. Yeah, maybe.
So what do you think that we want to do differently on this podcast to what people have already seen and heard?
presenting at least both sides of the argument or both sides of the issue. I think what we want to do with the podcast is help people out there understand, what might be influencing these issues and topics and some of the other stuff that they're seeing. Just as well, as well as having a general discussion on things.
Yeah, well, I'd like to get. I mean, it's really important to me that we just get some discussion going.
Yeah, for sure. And then that's one of the things that we want to emphasize about the podcast is that we do want to hear from you. So be sure to send us your feedback. We'll be very keen to hear what you think about the conversation today. You can reach us via email at incomingmissilepodcast@gmail.com or tweet us at incomingp. So welcome again to our first episode. We're going to take a short break and we'll begin the main discussion.
Point 2, reporting task complete.
All right, let's kick off and start this main topic. What we're planning to do, Kat, aren't we, is just have a chat about balance and some of the things relating to balance. Yeah, pretty topical at the moment. But generally, what we're hoping to do is briefly cover some of the things that are influencing balance at the moment. In this podcast, we'll talk about matchmaking and player skill, and in upcoming podcasts we'll cover some different things. But before we do get into that, Kat, you want to talk a little bit about what balance is overall and what it might mean to Mechwarrior?
Oh well, that's a big topic, of course. I mean, balance. Hopefully, anyone listening to this conversation has a, approximate knowledge of the ideas of balance. That, either your game is, let's say, symmetrically balanced, like chess, where everything moves the same way and has the same powers, and I take my turn, you take your turn. There's no real difference between us except for the white goes first. And then there's asymmetric balance, like most of the computer games we know and love to some extent. So things like StarCraft is a great example, where you have, the Zergs who rush and then the other factions who are a bit more slow and take time to build up. And then obviously Mechwarrior, you have various asymmetric factors at play. You have the different classes, light, medium, heavy assault. You have the different factions, Hemisphere and Clan. And then maybe even you have asymmetric game modes, like faction warfare, when one team is in siege, one team is defending, one team is assaulting. Potentially one of those is easier than the other, or you have to use a different kind of games depending on if you're defending or receiving. And so when we talk about balance in Mechwarrior, there's a lot of factors at work.
Some of the stuff that we've talked about are, there are examples of different mechanisms in the game that you could kind of tweak up or tweak down, or you need to tweak up or tweak down so that one thing offsets the other, right? And the reason that you don't, the reason you need those things to offset the other thing is so that there's not a dominant strategy that emerges, right? You don't just want one mech weapon style that dominates in a game where there's asymmetric balance. It's rock, scissors, paper, right? You want one to trump two, two to trump three, three to trump one.
Yeah, and if a dominant meta does develop, it's ideally something comes along that is a hard counter to that, where say we're talking about AC2s in Solaris, where at the moment in many of the divisions, especially the heavier ones, they are the best thing to take because they're low heat, they're high DPS, they're long range. You can really wear someone down while they close with you, and it's hard to deny that in some divisions that's really boring. to have every mech you face be that thing, and then if you don't bring that thing, you're probably not going to win as long as the person can aim.
Yeah, and that's the key risk you face with balance, right? If the dominant strategy emerge, it quickly makes the game stale and boring.
Well, I mean, from a developer point of view, you're putting resources into crafting those weapons and setting, later on down the tracks, adjusting values, setting values, all that stuff is worthless if nobody's using it.
So in regards to Mechwarrior, we're saying that you want that balance there so that the dominant strategy doesn't emerge what is known in the community as metas. You don't want a meta to emerge that everyone has to jump to or they lose. And of course, we can see that there is, for Mechwarrior, there's a ton of different mechanisms that need to be balanced.
And beyond that, I think, Mechwarrior is in a fairly unique position where not only does AC2s need to be balanced in Solaris, they also need to be balanced in solo queue, group queue, faction warfare scouting, comp queue. We've seen some rebalancing happen recently with AC2s because the stock builds only had like 1 ton of ammo for 2 guns, so better add a bit more ammo on those. So that's a way where one particular biome, one particular element of the game has influenced the balance of every sphere of the game, because let's not forget that those weapons and mechs are the same no matter where you take them.
And that's, again, maybe a challenge that Mechwarrior faces, is that with those mechanisms, there's lots of different mechanisms. They need to be balanced across lots of different situations. But if you're tweaking that mechanism up or down, it can put something else out of balance in another situation, in another game mode or another map, or Yeah,
exactly. So, for example, if AC2s at the moment are dominant in Solaris, like I'm suggesting, then how do you balance that? Because they're not overpowered in solo queue, group queue. So any changes that you make might make them underpowered in those paradigms. As I've already mentioned, there's faction warfare, which is, one bunch of mechs, one half of the mechs in the game versus a different half of the mechs in the game. And, in solo queue, those inner sphere and clan mechs are usually bunched together and mixed together, whereas in faction play, they're going to be only inner sphere or only clan, and somehow the balance still needs to work then.
Yeah, so you need to make those internal mechanisms work across different game modes that might actually be so different that they're almost like different games.
Yeah, well, that's, the inner sphere are tanky and the clan have, superior weapons. So as soon as you get one of those long range maps, the clans can outrange the inner sphere, and those balance decisions that you make to try and make that not overpowered or underpowered, then have an influence on other arenas in the game.
You're starting to make this sound like it's a bit tricky.
I don't envy them.
It doesn't sound like it's a task that anyone would want to take on. But hey, at least we can talk about why that might be the case. And I guess we're probably not talking about balance being perfect. Balance is a balance, and that it's ever changing. But I guess a lot of the conversation is about how do we make it move in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly right. And some people think that they have all the answers, but I think when you get right down to it in a granular level of detail of how moving one lever shifts another, then it is it's a lot of spinning plates.
Yeah, and this is spinning plates blindfolded while you're trying to do a handstand and while someone's throwing water balloons at you during an earthquake.
Yeah, while you're getting shot in the ass by a machine gun.
And someone's calling you bad names. So, I mean, we've talked about a couple of items that, or a couple of mechanisms that are really obvious around balance, and some of those levers that you pull, some of those plates that you are spinning are bigger than others, and they will influence other things. They will influence more other levers. One of the ones that is obviously pretty important to everyone, but isn't always taken into account, are things like player skill. and matchmaking.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about balancing the game for player skill, most people will jump to thinking about Matchmaker and how, if you're a good high skilled player, you don't want to be put in games with low skilled players because they'll drag you down or they'll make the game a bit more random. If you end up on the team with a lot of noobs and then you're a high skilled player, well, your possibility to influence the game is going to be limited.
Yeah. So even if we've got, so one of the first challenges around balance is even if you have got sufficient population, some players are going to be better than other players, and therefore you're going to get a disparity in a game.
Yeah, that's right. And so, what is your game going to do about that? I mean, obviously, you're making the best attempt to make your matchmaker as good as it can be. That would be a good first step. And while also trying to make sure people aren't waiting too long for a game. People don't want to be waiting, say, more than 5 minutes for a game. What mechanisms do we have in our game that we can, or what? Let's put this a different way. What mechanisms are there in Mechwarrior where you can allow a lower skilled player to give a higher skilled player a challenge?
Well, let me throw an even different aspect at you. Is it, rather than manipulating the mechanisms that would allow a lower skilled player to compete against a higher skilled player, is it not a better tactic to simply ensure that people with as close a skill level as possible are matched against each other?
I mean, ideally, yeah. Within the framework that I mentioned of you don't want to be waiting too long for a game. I think I worked out earlier today that the Owls list puts me in the top 3% of players, and even though that still means that the top 1% of players will beat the pants off me every time, I worked out that during my prime time, there's roughly an average of about 16 players of my skill or greater on at any one time. And I'm not what I would consider, a super awesome, talented player of the highest tier.
Okay, so you've mentioned the Yowls list, and I guess the Yowls list is a good way to illustrate one of the first challenges with player skill and how player skill might relate to matchmaking. Because to determine that you are in the top 3% and someone else is in the top 10%, then the Yowls list is looking at some key data points, based on the way people have performed in the game, and specifically, match score, KD, and stuff like that. So when we're looking at the Yowls list, that says you in the top 3%, on average, are going to score higher in those areas than me in the top 10%, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it has a formula that Scurro from Isengrim has
Shout out
developed.
to Scurro.
Yeah, nice work, man. It's a great resource where it looks at your match score and it looks at your games played and it looks like at what class you regularly play and gives you sort of an adjusted match score and then compares you to other players based on that.
But herein lies the problem. So if we are going to say that one player is better than another because they've scored high on those metrics, what we would want to be able to say is that when people go into games, there's an even playing field. If they do score higher, say if they get more kills or more damage or more match score, we know that it wasn't another factor that's come into play to allow them to score that way. So and we've already talked about the fact that with some of the maybe the lack of balance or some of the issues around matchmaking, it's not always the case where we're going to go into a solo queue game or a group queue game and the environment that we are playing the game in is going to be the same.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we can't control the kind of mechs that each person's bringing. They might be leveling a mech that they know is bad and just playing it for fun, or they might be bringing the hottest shit out of their garage.
Exactly right. There could be 100 different things, of course, that could mean that I didn't perform well in that particular game, and everyone out there will know these terms around NASCAR and potatoes and all these ways that we describe that a team hasn't worked well or the game isn't going to go well for us because of one of these factors coming into place. So if that's the case, if we know that it's not always going to be an even playing field when you go into a game, the figures that are coming out to calculate player skill, and if we use the Yarls list as an example, it's not always going to be that you're getting an accurate gauge of whether someone is skilled or not. So just even based on the metrics, it can be hard to gauge player skill that way because it's not an even playing field when we hit the battlefield.
Yeah, and it should be mentioned that PGI have never let us know what data they look at when they're using their matchmaker. I think people tend to, we have that really visible number on the front page when you log into the Mech Lab of your tier, and so people assume that is what the matchmaker looks at, tier primarily. And also they've talked about opening tiers up so that when the matchmaker's looking for a game, it's going to include this in that tier. But the truth of the matter is we don't actually know how the matchmaker works and what's under the hood because PGI hasn't told us.
But what we do know is that player skill alone can be tricky to calculate, right? So it's hard to get something that you could trust reliably simply because each player going into a game is going to have these other varying things that will influence it. And that can be things like balance. If the game's not balanced, then that can in fact affect player skill or player performance. So there's that, there's a relationship just there.
And there's one big one that I look at when I look at someone's stats on their Yarls list, and that is looking at their KD. Someone with a KD of 2 shouldn't be able to have as much influence on a game as to win, 3 times out of 4. Then what I can assume is that they're always running with the same group, or frequently running with the same group of also skilled players, and they, on average as a group, they're winning that many more games.
Yeah.
Because the leaderboard stats looks at group queue as well as solo queue.
Yeah. So automatically, you've looked at stats that have come out of the Yarls list, and from those stats, you're getting some insight around what the actual behaviours of that player might be, right?
Yeah, so on the surface, they might appear to be having a phenomenal influence on the outcome of their games, and that may be the truth. They may play in such a way that it means that they win that frequently, or these other factors are skewing the data.
Yeah, exactly. And if we're defining player skill by what that data looks like, that's where it can get tricky, because not only can the current state of balance and the current state of the game affect what your output's going to be. It might mean that you're doing more or less damage per game, or you've got more or less match score per game, depending on what current nerfs or what damage is being outputted by certain weapons. But the very fact that the same outputs might be explained by drastically different behaviors means that trying to determine balanced decisions based on player skill can start to get a little tricky.
Yeah.
A good judge of player skill, if there was a reliable way in the data to predict whether a certain player is on average going to be better than another player, would be great, because then you would have something to build a matchmaking system off, right? Then you could hopefully reliably place you, Captain Cat, with people close to you on the Yarls list if they were available.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say you're a data guy.
Yes.
Would you say that although people's individual statistics might be more likely to be skewed, on average in a population, those people of that same percentile would be better than people of a lower percentile? So say we took everyone who is the top 5% or more, and then on average, obviously, would you say that they're going to be better than people below them?
Yeah, I would. Although in going up to population, then technically what you're increasing is the number of data points, and therefore the sample size, and so you can, with better statistical power, predict. So if we're looking at the Yarls list as an example, even though these rankings are based simply on those outputs, how many what your KD is or what your average match score is. If there's enough data points, if there's a big enough sample, then when you're comparing two players, you would assume that they have been exposed to those same factors that we talked about earlier. So, they've been in the same number of games where people have NASCAR'd and it's gone tits up for them, or they've played the same number of group queue games, so they've had the advantage of team cohesion and those kind of things. But if that's not the case, then you, even with the population look, you aren't necessarily getting an accurate representation of player skill. What you might get through the Yales list, though, is that it might give you the relative position. So if it's ranking you in the top 3% and me in the top 10%, it's saying that it's predicting that you're better than me, and that prediction might be good. It may not be able to predict how good you are or what the difference is between me and you, but if there's enough data there, and if there's enough players, you can at least with some reliability say it's going to be better to place you, Captain Cat, in with Proton than it is me, because I'm going to get...
As long as I'm on his team, I'll be all right.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to die quicker. But yeah, I mean, at least the Yales list has done a good job of bringing that together and justifying why it's the case. But what it also highlights is that without knowing how PGI use that and what decisions they're making to judge whether one player is better than another, then suddenly player skill becomes an issue when you're trying to balance the game, because the outputs that are coming from people playing the game and performing might be influenced by the environment that they're operating in, and the way that environment's operating on them. Let's say certain mechs got nerfed that they liked to play, or certain play styles got nerfed. It may influence what those scores and what those damage outputs look like.
Here's an example for you that occurs to me. I'm trying to wrap my head around what you're saying. So here's an example. When I play Mechwarrior, I love to poke a mech, what they call poke mech. So I collect mechs. I always have a mech that I'm looking to get. I like being on Smurfy or MechDB these days and poring over the mechs and thinking, what don't I have? I want to get my hands on this thing. It looks interesting. It's something I don't already have. And then I've got 40 or more mechs in my lab which are being leveled at any one time. And so when I go in an evening, oftentimes I'm just checking those ×2 multipliers off, trying to run through, grind those out, and get them up to those 91 skill points. Whereas I know other people in our unit love to just play their favorite mech all the time, usually a meta mech. Previously Halberingers, also, IV4s, those kind of things, and just play them and play them and play them and just hone their skills down onto that particular mech and its play style. And obviously, when you compare those two examples of those two players, the person who plays the same mech all the time, their stats are going to be a lot higher than they would have otherwise been, than as compared to the person who prefers to always be having a new mech, taking it out there with one skill point, whatever it is, and maybe it's not the best thing out there, but it's fun and different. Do you agree with would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's a perfect example, and you might call that metric play diversity. So the different builds and mechs that you play, that is something that PGI could measure, and therefore that could be something that you factor into your formula when you're determining how good an individual player was. Because if I'm taking out that same diversity of builds and mechs as you are, you may still perform on average better than me because of this underlying factor, which is player skill. But if we don't acknowledge that, and if we don't take into account something like play diversity, then suddenly your stats are going to look different to mine if I'm playing the same mech all the time. And an even more concrete example would be that if I'm in an assault and you're in a light, it may mean that I can do, on average, I can do more. I can get more kills and I can get a higher damage output. And the Yales list factor that in because they weight a score with a light compared to a score with another build, depending on what the averages are. But it's that kind of view, and this is the challenge.
What you're saying is that it would be a trap for PGI to not balance the game around the idea that people's stats are influenced by all these sort of other factors, like whether they bring the same mech every time.
Absolutely. You may be getting false positives or false negatives. So a mech, a play style, or a weapon system may look better or worse depending on those other factors. In particular, a player's skill level or the amount of damage that they're outputting will depend on those other factors, such as what kind of play diversity and build diversity do they use.
Right. Because you could look at someone's stats and think, oh, here's a good player, I'll put them in this game, but they might have a mech that's really not going to allow them to carry.
Yeah, you're right. And someone, let's say you were measuring play diversity, someone might be showing as having a high player skill, but if you know that they're playing a build that's not optimized, you might be better off putting them in a match with players of lower skill that do have mechs that are optimized.
Right, or that, and by optimized, you could mean that the build on it is not to its full potential of what that mech can do, or also that it doesn't, say, have 91 skill points or something like that.
Yeah, you could choose a whole lot of data points, but for example, the number of skill points it has could be one.
It's an easy one because it's just one number, right?
Yeah, of course it is. But then there's a lot of just one numbers, such as the heat ratio, the damage output, DPS. There's a lot of indications that you can get of a mech's power.
Because you can take a really good mech and then put a shit build in it.
Yeah, and the reverse is true as well. You can take a really bad build, but through good positioning and player skill, you can still do a ton of damage.
Something else that occurs to me as well is if you get down into a more granular level of how the matchmaker works, it also needs to, once it's got 24 players, put them in 2 teams of 12, and if it's got one real outlier player, one thing it might already be doing is putting them in a team of lower skill players to face that team of average skill players that it's got. We're talking relative average, higher, lower. Hopefully they're as close as we can get them in the first place. And then expecting that higher skill player to carry the game with those other low players, and yet whatever mech they've brought to do that is not equipped to do that job.
Yeah. Well, what you're doing now is you're outlining just how tricky this process could be, and it's made trickier by not having some very solid ideas about what makes up player skill, and in particular, what the best approach is when you're placing, people of varying skills together. And again, it highlights for us just how big an influence player skill might have for what decisions you're going to make on balance, particularly if those decisions are based on, the outputs that you're seeing from how people are performing.
Yeah. Here's a question for you. Do you think that PGI wants their game to be balanced?
Yes.
Okay, so what about on an individual match level? Do you think that PGI wants every match to be balanced?
Aspirationally, yes. I mean, they may face the reality that they are trying to get as close as possible, but I think that's a realistic output. I mean, I think it would be disingenuous to say we're going to aim to get every match balanced. But this is another good reason why player skill as a mechanism for balance is really important, because player skill can be a factor that makes any mech worthwhile. And if you are getting good balance around player skill, let's say you are more often than not putting closer skilled players together in games, you have to worry less about whether individual mechs are balanced.
There is a couple of reasons why I think you might deliberately unbalance your matchmaker in a game, and one of those is that this is a free-to-play game, and you want people to keep playing your game. And so it's important that you let them win sometimes. And if you're a low-skilled player, then perhaps the only way to guarantee you a win now and then is to deliberately put you in a matchup against even lower skilled players. Tinfoil hat time.
Yeah, look, and the reason that I kind of wouldn't buy into that conspiracy theory is with the way that Mechwarrior has a uniqueness to it than say other first person shooters, in that it's a little bit slower and there's a definite importance on some key skills. It's really, if you in Mechwarrior, if you influence one thing, it has ramifications. As we've talked about, it has ramifications across so many different areas, and so it's really hard to isolate one thing and make that the noob gun that new people can use to get in. A good matchmaking system becomes the best way to give new players a chance to learn those things about the game, learn to love the game through playing, because they're up against people that are in the same situation.
I guess to gainsay my own conspiracy theory, if there's anything I've learned about Mechwarrior, it's that there are so many random factors that even if you tried to hand someone a win on a plate, they might still lose, or they could easily still lose because of the way that their team moves, or the loadout that because some guy forgot to equip ammo for his gun, or all these uncontrollable factors.
Yeah, exactly, dude. And that's, Mechwarrior has these layers of complexity that just add to the balancing picture. So we have talked about player skill and the way that that ties into balance and the way that balance ties into wit. The next thing that I want to talk about, because this ties directly in, and we've talked about it a little bit, is the matchmaking. So player skill feeds into the matchmaker because it's the mechanism through which you would put people of the same ability at the game into the same game, and therefore maximize the opportunity for them to have a good experience. The other thing to keep in mind is that matchmaking is fundamental because it's going to give you the most even playing field, so that if you're looking at the outputs from those games, if the matchmaking is good, then you've got the best opportunity to know that the data that you're seeing from it is true. So if someone's performing well in a match that that they're playing with players of equivalent or better player skill, on average, it's a better reflection that they have actually gone well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that would be pretty straightforward, right? To say that if we could get good metrics around player skill, and PGA might already have these, but if we had a good way to say Captain Cat is a 38 and Cozened Indigo is a 30, so we're going to use that when we factor in if we're going to put them in the same match or not. The problem that we have, though, is that we don't do matchmaking on player skill that we know of. We do it on tiers, right?
Yeah, well, like I alluded to earlier, we don't know what the PGI matchmaker does behind the scenes. It could be doing all sorts of things. It's the only available or visible metric that we get shown is the tier on your front end. And for all we know, that you'd hope, in fact, that Matchmaker does a lot more after the fact. I mean, once it's found 24 players, that it's still got to break them up into two teams. We know that it tries to balance those teams into, if this team has 3 assaults, the other team has 3 assaults. It tries to, at least in solo queue.
Yeah. Well, this is where the tier system becomes a real risk for matchmaking, because if the tier system is about identifying players, and then after that it's just about making sure that you've got the right numbers and you've got some of the structural things that you need for a game, so that you don't have 4 assaults on one side and 10 assaults on the other. If the tier system plays a big role in what players you get, then you're almost nullifying player skill. All the metrics that feed into player skill are almost nullified. They're almost abandoned, because as soon as you reach tier 1 and I reach tier 1, for matchmaking purposes, we are considered equivalent. And the only thing that might separate us getting in the same game is what mech that we have chosen.
And I've had my tier disabled for over a year now, because I got to, I mean, it sounds like humble brag, but I got to max tier 1. It stayed there. Well, I don't need that information anymore after a couple of months, so just turn it off.
The bigger risk in it becoming just boring to look at is that if the tier system is based purely on the amount of time that you play, and that everyone will slow creep or fast creep towards it, it means once you do hit tier 1, and in fact probably tier 2, depending on how the matchmaker treats you, as soon as you hit a tier, the maximum tier for matchmaking purposes, it means that your performance, your metrics, your player skill are now virtually irrelevant from a matchmaking perspective. I might be tier 1, you might be tier 2, and we end up in the same game, but the difference between how good we actually are might be significant. And the risk to that, of course, is that if I become tier 1 and I can't move back down the tiers, I can actually get worse at the game, but then still end up in the same game as you.
Mm.
So there, you introduce another thing that might be influencing the data that you are getting that informs what you do about balance. So the way mechs are performing, the way certain playstyles are performing, the way certain pilots are performing will now be influenced by that matchmaking system, because you are getting further away, or you're reducing your chances that you're going to get games where people are as close together in their skill as they can be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it should be said that if there's any sort of newer players listening, that there is a sort of an ongoing feeling within the community, or um, a, a, a common myth that doesn't necessarily mean untrue, but a logic that that the tier system is just what they call an XP bar, and if you just play for long enough, eventually, you know, the way that the tier system works, if you win a game, you're pretty much guaranteed to gain points into that tier system, even if you did terribly. If you lose a game, you can lose tier, but even then, you're more likely to stay where you are, or even if you do quite well, like say fairly well, like say do 500 damage or so, you'll gain again.
Yeah. But the problem being that your match score and your performance now is only affecting how quickly you will go up those tiers, rather than where you should truly be positioned on that tier system. So if that's the start of our data gathering exercise, we start by matchmaking people to matches. They then play that matches. We get output in the form of data, and then we use that data to see whether the game is balanced or not. Now, there are some other factors, but obviously that's a big one. The data output's telling us how certain weapon systems, how certain mechs are performing against others. But with a matchmaking system the way that it is, you're not necessarily having a fundamental level where you can trust the numbers that you're getting out of it. And that's why it becomes such a big influence on the balance decisions you make.
Well, that's a big point. So you're saying that you're making balanced decisions based on matchmaker.
Balance is about detecting when a dominant strategy is emerging, when a playstyle, a mech, a weapon system is outperforming its other equivalents, and therefore everyone has to jump to it or they get left behind. But we're basing those decisions, and we're basing whether something is outperforming something else on a matchmaking system that doesn't set an even playing field for everyone.
Right.
So I might be matched into the same match as you because we're both tier 1, but there could be a significant difference between our skill levels, and therefore my match score might be much lower than it should be.
I see.
And yeah, and it's not because you are certainly better than me, but the difference in our match scores is explained by player skill, not necessarily because of the weapon systems or the mech that I'm using.
So let me just sum up to check that I've understood. So what you're saying is that an ineffective matchmaker could lead us to draw incorrect conclusions about how to balance our game beyond the matchmaker.
Absolutely. It would at least be something that you would need to factor in when you're seeing the outputs.
So it might suggest, because our matchmaking is leading us down, it might suggest that we need to buff or nerf a certain weapon playstyle, because those people who are our higher skilled players that are being thrown in with our lower skilled players are bringing a weapon system or playstyle that's just dominating the people that they're being thrown in together with.
Yes, and you can go even further. You could say that if the matchmaking system was good and players of equal skill were more likely to be playing together, you wouldn't necessarily need to have balance across weapon systems or mechs, because player skill is, as we talked about before, player skill is a bigger factor in whether someone will perform in a game or not. And even if high skill players are going towards a certain meta, they're going to be faced up against each other anyway. Therefore, that meta isn't necessarily going to be as effective, or at least the hard counters that get developed for that meta might need to be. So, to give you an example, let's say the top 1% of players were constantly getting matched across each other. Do you think there'd be many loom boats in those games?
Only if they want to troll each other.
Exactly, but if they try and do that because they're up against other games, then they're going to get smoked up. And again, maybe the best example of that is if we looked at a comp game, a Div A game, between a Div G game. Those games are going to look very different in the types of mechs that are taken, and the strategies that are used in doing that. If the matchmaker was better, then you should see more of those good players, more of a Div A type game, and the lower tier, the lower skill players should be more a Div G. Therefore, you may not need to do the same balancing along weapons or mechs, because you're pitting the players of equal skill together, and weapons mechs doesn't become as significant.
Right.
You wouldn't need to buff LRMs, because lower skilled players that like to use LRMs would be most often coming against other lower skill players.
I see what you're saying. So I think you'd still need, I mean, the way that you're saying it makes it sound like we know that those top 1% of players, or those very high skilled players, for the most part, prefer to bring their best mechs as well. So they're the best players with the best mechs, with the best loadouts, because they got good for a lot of the time by learning and researching and attempting to understand all the mechanisms of the game, because they're invested in it, and so it seems to me that if we only put the top players against each other, that at the top the meta would get very stale very fast, because it would be the best weapon system and mech versus exactly the same thing every time.
Potentially. But you don't know that without operating that way. And again, the precedence that we do have is around comp games. So if we tracked Div A across the last few MRBC seasons, do we see a difference there? Has there been a shift across the type of builds used? Remembering when you are introducing new things into the game as well, you add the potential to automatically introduce meta. And what balance should be about doing is making sure that there's not a dominant strategy that emerges. It shouldn't be about not having those strategies change. So it's not that you don't want a meta, you just want different metas. The best case scenario is where it's an ever-changing thing, so that people can use those skills around looking at what strategy, doing that work in the mech lab and those kind of things.
To answer your perhaps semi-rhetorical question, we have seen a shift in meta over the last MRBC seasons, and I mean I haven't played MRBC going back very far, but having watched a few, we know that that as certain mechs have been added to the game, which have made machine guns super viable, for example, that shifted the meta up. For the most part, especially at the higher levels, you'll see teams just using whatever the best thing is, say laser vomit in the height of that, and then it's only a few outliers where it seems like a team will try to surprise the other team by, suddenly bringing LRMs, for example, let's say, and that's because they're relying on the fact that the enemy team is going to do something very predictable. Hey, let's throw a curveball at these guys and bring LRMs, and potentially, hopefully, capitalizing on that, and if not, entertaining the people who are watching.
Yeah, and that's when you can start to force those high skill players to use different strategies rather than different mech builds or purely assigning the meta to the type of mech and play style. When it starts to become around strategic decisions, that's when you're in a good place, because it means that your weapons and your mechs are probably pretty balanced, and people are having to look outside that to be able to beat another team.
I suppose to reframe this topic from another angle, and we're talking about balance and we're talking about player skill, one of the challenges PGI face is that at the top levels of the game, a weapon might be super potent, like let's say laser vomit, because those top level players can peek out of cover. As soon as they expose, they're firing their lasers, they're holding their whole burn on a single component, and then they're getting straight back into cover without taking hardly any damage in return. So at those top levels, laser vomit can be very strong, whereas conversely, at the lower levels, the player might come out, be standing in the open, see an enemy mech, burn it, just try to hit it, wash it all over, and those weapon systems are very ineffective at those levels. So what do? Do you buff the weapon for the lower skill players, or do you nerf it for the higher skill players?
Or do you make sure that higher skill players are playing other higher skill players and lower skill players are playing other lower skill players so that they can use the same weapon in two different ways?
Yeah, it's just still could be a risk that at those higher levels that people will just only bring that one dominant weapon because they're the kind of people that go out there to win.
Absolutely, and then that's what balanced decisions would come down to. Balanced decisions would see where you can clearly see that type of meta is emerging, and then make decisions on ways to counter that or to have that the meta shift. But to make balanced decisions where you can't hand on heart say that the data that you're seeing reflects what you think it reflects, that's when you start to get into trouble.
Right.
And that's why knowing player skill and having a good matchmaking system, they're two of the most fundamental things to allow you to make good decisions around balance.
I've seen the argument put out there, and it holds some water, that if we balance our game based on the way that 1% of our players play, it might create an unbalanced game for 99% of our players.
Exactly. Which is why you need reliable data across all skill levels of player. Because then you can see how a certain mech, weapon system, or nerf or buff operates across the board. Given how big an influence player skill can be on performance, you want to be seeing how that weapon is performing across all of those skill levels.
So your key takeaway from this that I'm getting from you again and again is it's not worth even trying to balance your game if you're not getting good data.
Yes, absolutely. Because the risk being, particularly if you're using bad data.
Right. So you're trying to balance your game based on bad assumptions.
Yeah, particularly if you're trying to match those bad assumptions up with anecdotal community feedback or your experience of the game. It's just too easy to reach false positives or false negatives, or to make some logical errors. If you've got good data, you use the data to give you insight, and then you test that insight against the lived experience of the people within PGI, with the community as well. If they're giving you counters to what your insight are, then you go back to that good data and see whether that's supported and whether it's just that you've pulled the wrong insight out of it. If we have a matchmaker that is not giving us the base level that we need, if it's not pitting players of equal skill against each other, then straight away we're not going to get performance metrics that are reflective of player skill. Instead, you're opening the door for all of these other factors to come in and start influencing how different weapons perform, how different mechs perform, because you've got such widely different player skills in the games.
It makes perfect sense to me, and I really hope that PGI do look into that or are looking into it already. I mean, there's been a big push within the community for a long time for Matchmaker to be improved. I mean, what kind of things would you hope that they were doing?
What I'd hope they'd do is look at a revamp of the tier system, so that if you do have tiers, that those tiers can be directly related to your player skill. So if you are tier 1, it does say that you are you do have a certain skill level, and that there's mobility in the tiers, so that if I get worse at the game, so for example, if I go up to tier 1, I find myself playing constantly with players that are better than me, and I can't get better and compete, it's better for me to drop back down to tier 2. So if there's no mobility in the tier system, it makes it an even worse representation of how good someone is at the game. So yeah, that's what I'd hope that they would look at, that they're revamping the tier system so that it does reflect player skill, and that there's mobility so that you can move up and down.
PGI have said in the past, that they were concerned that high level, if there was too much mobility in the tier system, that high level players would deliberately tank games to try and go down and smurf people.
Yeah, look, I think that's a definite possibility, but in my experience, it's easier data-wise to pick out where people are deliberately sandbagging, and to do something about that. Secondly, it's making assumptions about why people play the game. I think if you talked to the community and talked to people that do play the game, I think you'd find that it'd be a very, very small amount that would want to doctor the system that way. You're better to make it 95, make it good for 95% of the players, and if 5% of it are using it to their advantage, it's probably still a good thing.
Speaking for myself, I can say that I am finding it extremely frustrating at the moment to be having these bad matchup games, and there's no way that I would deliberately put myself in that situation because, say I push my tier down, well, the people in my team are going to be bad as well.
Yeah, and not necessarily bad, but not necessarily as good as you need them to be for the level. One of the other massive benefits that if you did revamp the tier system, and if the tier system was a more accurate reflection of player skill, and therefore high skill players such as yourself were more often getting matches that were good, Proton's probably going to have a much better experience of the game if he's playing games that are close to Div A games. He may be at a skill level that it's going to be much harder for PGI to do that, but he probably gets more satisfaction when he's playing those games that are against other high level teams. What you would also get from doing that is make those high skill players just feel a little bit better about it. I think a lot of the outrage around balance and a lot of the complaints that those high skill players have are because they don't feel as though they're having fun. They're not having fun. They're not getting in games where they feel it's competitive for them or they can be tested. And they see things happening to the weapon systems and the mechs that they like, and that just makes it even less fun for them. But if they were constantly getting matched up against other players that are near their skill level, I think they wouldn't be as concerned about changes that are going to happen to weapons and stuff like that. I think you would get a massive flow of support from the community, from those high tier players, if efforts were made to put them with other high skill players more often.
Personally, I'd love for the game to have a better matchmaker. I think, and to be the idea to me of getting clean data on how weapons are performing is very appealing. Like with it, and you can say at this level, these weapons are doing this well, and that requires a good matchmaker. I can understand that, and I really hope that we get that sometime soon.
With a good measure of player skill, and therefore a good matchmaking system to put those players together more often than not, hopefully you would then have a better idea of which weapon systems and mechs need to be changed, and hopefully you would need to make less balanced decisions. I mean, that would be the ultimate goal.
I think that the Sleipnir is the mech that my number one mech that I would recommend that a new player goes out and buys, because it's pretty easy to play the play styles that it can take a diverse loadout of weapons. You can take 4 UAC 5s, you can take the heavy Gorse and 3 medium lasers, or 4. You can take quad LBX, which is super easy mode. I mean, and then other builds as well, but it's got good geometry. It's easily one of the best mechs in the game, but I still don't think it should be nerfed. I think that is clearly the kind of factors that it takes to make a sort of, run of the mill, the IV4 is another example. Those are the kind of those are the kind of quirks that it takes to make one of those Innisphere mechs really worth playing. I think other mechs need to be brought up to that level, not at nerfed down. It's perfect where it is.
Personally, I think we need some better information as to what needs to happen with those mechs, before we decide to make those changes. So, yeah, let's hope.
If people had something that they'd heard that they disagreed with, or if they just wanted to send us some autistic screeching, like, how do they get hold of us?
Yes, well, 2 very, very good methods. You can flick us an email at incomingmissilepodcast@gmail.com, or you can send us a tweet at incomingp on the Twitter.
Yeah, seriously, guys, we would actually love to hear what you say. And, if you come up with something interesting to us, we will read it out and discuss it on the podcast. Obviously, a key thing for us with starting this podcast is we just want something out there for ourselves that is just some rational, interesting, ranging discussion around this game that we all know and love. And having your feedback, and even if it's disagreeing with us, certainly if you want to agree with us, send us that too. But yeah, even if it's disagreeing with us, we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. All right, thanks for listening. We'll take a quick break and hit you with the next segment. Alright, 07 Mechwarriors, we are back now with a segment that we call Sailing the Brown Sea.
Yay!
And that's where we get in our scuba gear and everything maritime related, and brave the forums or Reddit to find something either particularly amusing or particularly significant, something to talk about. And today, for our first one, we have a post by Youngburrow.
That's Backlaw, isn't it?
Also known as Bear Claw, and that was posted today. And it was said, I have a question. What made the community how it is now? Us? Them? No one. I'm curious. How do we get where we are now? Cause? Effect? Blame? Where do we put it? Who did this to us? Reason for salt? Just for memes? Why? Developer fault? Community fault? How do we hold accountable for the who do we hold accountable for the situation now? Can we even hold anyone accountable? Is everyone innocent in this dilemma? Was there a solution? Ever? I want to know. Tell me. Please. There's a lot of question marks.
I was going to say, your voice was getting pretty high-pitched with all those question marks.
Yeah, those inflections are killing me.
Blame?
Unpick this one for me, Capn. What's happening here for Bear Claw?
Well, I think there's some context needed here. For those that don't know, Bear Claw was recently handed a ban and made a sort of a public show of we've seen a few of them lately, of exiting the game, kind of a fuck this shit, 2 fingers up kind of thing. And I guess, on one hand we could say he genuinely cares about this game. He's very invested in it. Or is he just trying to start some shit with this? What do you think?
Yeah. Look, I think he probably still wants to be related to the community. I mean, there's a few responses in here. There's a few upvotes. There's a couple of doozies in here. Calvin is credit 6 team says basically tabletop grognards, insisting that what's a grognard, Capn?
Neckbeards, is that the same thing?
Okay, pass. Insisting that PGI shoehorn mechanics from a game played with figurines and dice into a real-time FPS. PGI refuses to touch weapon weights and crits because of this. Yeah, I mean, there's some amusing stuff in there, and yeah, maybe it's a chance for Beer to express maybe his frustration.
I mean, I do find it amusing. All these people are like, "Fuck you, I'm out," and then within hours they're back at the window looking in.
Yeah.
I hope you guys aren't having any fun in there.
Yeah,
the game's shit, by the way.
Yeah, shouting through the window, eh? Yeah, I think.
Hey, don't forget, I uninstalled, guys. I uninstalled. I looked it up, by the way. I looked it up. Grognard is from the French, meaning an old soldier, and it's like a derogatory slang for a wargamer. So I guess it's like a, tabletop kind of derisive term.
Nice. Calvin
I'm gonna
is
use that.
credit 16. Yeah, shout out. That's nice. We'll try and incorporate that. That's good. For Young Bear, what do you, from the responses that you've got in there, what do you think is taken away from that? Just supporting his, is he getting his own little echo chamber there?
Well, I don't know. Maybe he was hoping for a salt mine or just a lead, a few rees of support. But actually, people have come through with some considered answers and put some good,
example, sir.
Oh, just sort of looking back at the decisions that PGI has made and actually, some of the areas where they thought they might have done better, or the reasons why they say PGI is to blame.
Yeah, I mean, shout out TK Sachs in this post. He's got a couple there, Kamikaze, Viking, MWO as well. Some good, as you say, some good reasonable points there. Just kind of at least trying to bring some balance to that discussion, which we're all about.
Well, I think despite the diverse range of answers that you always get to these kind of questions, the thing I always take away is that a lot of people really care about this game and want it to succeed. Like I want it to succeed. I want, I'm annoyed about some changes. I get frustrated, but I'm still still holding out hope that we're gonna get to the golden age of Mechwarrior, and everything's gonna be so much better in the near future. We're gonna see a sudden U-turn on one little thing that's just gonna make the game that much better. And I mean, we saw a big bump in player numbers recently from people. Potentially Solaris had an effect as well, but I think mostly actually BattleTech, because Mechwarrior has always been a game that struggled to market itself, and a lot of people started playing BattleTech, which is a game that was very visible, and saw the models and started looking into websites and all that kind of thing, and stumbled across Mechwarrior. I mean, I've had people come into my unit and be like, yeah, I've always been a Mechwarrior fan, but I never knew this game existed. It's like, such a shame to hear that PGI are not tapping their target market. So the people who loved Mechwarrior games do not know that there's a free online Mechwarrior game out there. And I mean, it's a bit of a segue to say, like, there was a big bump in player numbers recently, and then that started to taper off again. It must be hard to walk into this kind of rage as a new player and not be turned off.
Yeah, so any new players listening, just maybe wait a year before you start reading Reddit, all the forums, just to develop up. You just you can't. A sudden increase in salinity levels can be detrimental.
Bad for your health. I mean,
health.
if you are new, I mean, I've seen posts by new players as well going, what's going on here? Like, what's your problem? The game seems okay. Like, it's true that a lot of the annoyance and frustration that players feel is a product of the amount of time that they've been playing the game. This game's been around for 5 years, and people get frustrated that time and in their eyes at least, that time and again PGI miss the mark. As a new player, you kind of don't need to worry about that stuff, but do know that a lot of the time these people, especially the higher level players, are making good points. I mean, they're angry and they're frustrated about it. They've really invested in this game. They've invested their, a shit ton of time into the game. If they're in a top tier comp team, they've been practicing every night for tournaments, and they've, maybe even made quite a lot of money off it. There's people out there who have their whole career is based around this game, and it must suck for them to see changes that they feel break the game.
Yeah.
But
and guys like Beer Claw are looking for those answers, and I guess this post that we're seeing here is is a reach out to the community to say, well, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've had quite a few people in our unit Discord coming on and saying, basically, I've uninstalled the game, and then they're back every day to say, I've uninstalled the game, and it's kind of frustrating to see. I don't want new players to be turned off the game because these guys are leaving, and quite honestly, and I mean, even though their concerns are completely justified in a lot of cases, there's no need for the last thing this game needs is for a whole lot of new blood to be turned away from the game by the salt.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. All right, Bearclaw, you keep posting, and I hope you do find those answers that you're looking for. So yeah, just
maybe write a rap or something.
Yeah. That's a tear up riff there. That's nice. That's good. Squeeze that one in. Awesome, guys. So yeah, do check out the forums. Do check out that post if you are on there, and by all means, contribute and read some of the good responses that you get on there. There's certainly a lot of good stuff that you can get from some pretty experienced players. But as always, do try and keep in mind the other side to it as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and if you do want some advice on how to play the game, or you just want to jump on and chill with a bunch of guys who know what they're doing, there's a ton of units out there who are always happy. Like, on the surface, these guys' personas on the internet are salty because they're invested, like I said. But if you a lot of them are really approachable and they're really keen to help people out. And there's a ton of units out there where you could learn a lot about all the secret rules of this game.
Nice. Couldn't agree more. GG.
GG.
All right. We will come back to you next time with another post. So if you want to be featured on the podcast, then get out there and put something funny on there that we'll pick up, or send something to us and point us to it so that we can chat about it.
You heard, Cozened, guys. Man. The saltiest guys will get featured on the podcast.
Hey, if you're going to sail the Brown Sea, you expect some stormy waters. Nice, G. All right, man. GG.
GG.
Point 3, reporting task complete.
So we're going to close the show today with a few reminders and announcements. Of course, a reminder to send us your feedback and comments via our email account, incomingmissilepodcast@gmail.com, and you can send us a tweet via Twitter @incomingp. The first announcement is we will pick one of those comments or tweets, and that lucky listener will win a mech pack of their choice of the upcoming mechs that have been announced. So send us what you thought about today, particularly your opinion on the topics we've covered, and you might just get rewarded with a free mech pack. And if you did enjoy the podcast today, then please consider sponsoring us. We have a Patreon account, and you can find that at Incoming Missile on Patreon. Any support that you do give us will of course go to producing more content. So thanks again. I hope you're having good games out there, and we'll see you next time.
sequence initiated.